Can I ask Brother Colin Walsh? Colin, where are you? Would you come up and introduce Archbishop Patrick O'Regan? He's got a Victorian introducing you here, Your Grace, which I think shows our universality here. We accept people from all walks, from all parts of the country, including Archbishops from Sale, I believe.
Thank you, Brother David. Archbishop O'Regan, ladies, brothers and guests. On this year, the 100th anniversary of the Knights of the Southern Cross in South Australia, it is with great pleasure that we have His Grace Archbishop O'Regan with us this evening. Patrick Michael O'Regan was born on the 8th of October 1958. He was the third of 4 children born to Colin and Daphne O'Regan. He was born in Perthville, New South Wales, a small rural village over 10 kilometres south of Adelaide. Like many Catholic children of the year of that time, he was educated by the Sisters of St Joseph. He then moved to St Stanislaus College, Bathurst for his secondary education. His Grace commenced study for the priesthood at St Columba College, Springwood, and then later at St Patrick College. He was ordained a priest for the priesthood at St Columba College, Springwood, and then later at, apologies. He was ordained a priest at St Michael and St John's Cathedral in Bathurst on the 2nd of September 1993. He then went on to serve as assistant priest in a number of country New South Wales parishes. During 1994 and 1995, he commenced higher studies in Paris before returning to Australia, initially to Orange, before being appointed as parish priest in Wellington. You can't hear me? He again returned to France in 2001 and 2002, graduating with a degree in liturgy and sacramental theology. In 2008, he was appointed as diocesan administrator in the Diocese of Bathurst. Then in 2014, it was announced by Pope that Pope Francis had appointed His Grace the Bishop of Sale in Victoria. Just 5 years later, however, on the 19th of March 2020, it was announced again by Pope Francis that His Grace had been appointed as the Archbishop of Adelaide, an archdiocese with 57 parishes. His ordination as the 9th Archbishop of Adelaide took place at St Francis Xavier Cathedral on Monday, May the 25th, 2020. Ladies and brothers, I do notice, however, that there's a real problem with these notes. There's a very big omission. Nowhere do they say what team His Grace barracks for. I now call on His Grace Archbishop O'Regan to address us on this, our 100-year anniversary.
Thanks very much for that little introduction. And when I went to Sale, I didn't know much about AFL. So I thought, to be fair to everyone, I thought I'd be there for about 16 years. So that at that time there were 16 teams in the competition. So I thought, innocently that I'd follow a different team every year. I was quickly dissuaded from that idea, and the closest team to Bathurst at that time was Greater Western Sydney, so I was allotted that team. I too pay my respects to the Ghana people and welcome to everyone tonight. Dear sisters and brothers in Christ, maybe the name Eusebius of Caesarea, 265 to 339, may or may not be familiar to you. He was a bishop, exegete, theologian, polemicist, and historian, whose account of the first centuries of Christianity in his ecclesiastical history is a landmark in Christian hagiography. In this 4th century pioneer work, he gives a chronological account of the development of early Christianity from the 1st century to the 4th century. What is memorable and important for us is not only the facts he tells, but the story that he tells behind it. The history, as it's called, was the first full-length historical narrative written from a Christian point of view. It tells a story. It reminds people of the narrative and how the connections are made. And it also, from his point of view, was a vindication of the Christian religion against the Roman Empire. The story in this sense is not a made-up bedtime story, but the word that we use to describe our own history, identification, and who we are. We have to remember that there was a big persecution going on called the Diocletian Persecution from the year 303 to 313. It hadn't long finished when Eusebius was writing his story. Although some call into question some of the accuracies of some of his descriptions, what they appreciate most deeply is how he connected the story and gave people a sense of purpose and of hope. It was a traumatic time in the church where many people were martyred. They were on the outside. They had no common story apart from the gospel story and their belief in Jesus. They had no history, no one to tell them of their own origins, not even to see how they, with that resilient sense of life, could come through. Eusebius gave the church a narrative and recalled back to its proper roots, proclaiming the good news, a deep relationship with the risen Christ, and service of the poor. For many, the previous time of persecution was not good news. But if you take away all the difficulties and uncover good news, there it is, the story of who we truly are. Whatever else might be said about this character Eusebius, he did give people of his time their own story to rejoice in, a narrative in which they could be proud. He reminded them that the central figures in the narrative were first of all God, and the second, those who put their trust in God. It strikes me that as we gather here tonight, in the far that room, what a narrative that is, it is to tell a story, a narrative, not something of way past long ago, but one in which many of us here have had a hand in shaping. Recent events in our society and the church have seemed to elbow us off our narrative, somehow sucked our energy and focus to such an extent that the narrative was being told by others, and rather than being good news, has suddenly and unexpectedly pivoted to mainly bad news. We know that nothing in this life is unalloyed. Every family has its all sorts of colours, hues and shades that make up its complexion. And that's what makes humanity attractive and at times exasperating. So too human history and the nature of the church in history. When I say that Mr. Paul Hawkes is something of a Eusebius, by which I mean that he tells the story of the first 100 years of the Knights of the Southern Cross, I'm also saying that maybe his mastery of the facts differs from Eusebius. In presenting us tonight with this new volume, a bold story, well proven, our 100 years of the Knights of the Southern Cross, he weaves together the story of society, the church, and the Knights in a careful way, noting the interaction between these three elements and the generous and extraordinary responses from a faith-filled perspective. Humanity has experienced great dislocation because of the manifold effects of COVID-19. People have become a little more tentative and anxious about life and what it means to be human. The role of faith in our lives has always been that of connecting us with God, with the biggest story that is ours, to which we belong, that which is really our story. It leads us always from fear to hope, from anxiety to trust, and for us ultimately trusting in God, so that, as St. Paul reminds us, God might be all in all. So, thank you, Paul, for being a bearer of our story thus far, and conveying through your story, properly understood, that hope and what it means to see grace at work amongst us. Staying for a moment with the historical theme, it is said that of all the religious orders that ever existed, only 30% lasted more than 100 years. While this statement needs much more research, it reminds us that religious orders arise in the church not so much out of the egos of their founders as to responding to the dual impulse of God's will and a particular need. Each order continues to ask itself the question, what is the need to which we are attempting to respond? What is the need to which we are attempting to respond? And it strikes me that that question is equally what each organisation ought continually, but not obsessively, ask itself. What is the need to which we are attempting to respond? In architectural language, there is a saying that form follows function. In other words, the form a building takes ought to reflect the function the building seeks to carry out. Now, this is not mere formalism, which leaves everything blandly utilitarian, for as Dostoevsky reminds us, beauty will save the world, but a reminder that buildings that work best assist us if they mirror well the function, or maybe in our terms mission, for which they exist. Within the Catholic Church in Australia, we've been doing this very thing in preparing for, and now being in the midst of, our plenary council. The last one, 80 years ago. We haven't rushed into it. And we as a national church, and here in the Archdiocese of Adelaide, continue to ask ourselves that question. What is the need to which we are attempting to respond? It would seem to me that while we rightly gather tonight to celebrate this centenary of what has been and what is, we must also look to the next 100 years and ask ourselves, What is the need to which we are attempting to respond? Another form of that question is, why do we do what we do? It's a question always that I ask myself. Many are the demands of leadership today, yet unless we stop and ask ourselves this question from time to time, we can risk drifting in our own lives and our mission. So I gently ask you tonight, why do you do what you do? Built into the rhythm of my life is daily prayer, days of reflection and annual retreats to help reset and attend to that important question. Invariably, these times are times of, to use a theological word, for me, communion. They are times which are life-giving and allow me to see not simply through my own very limited eyes, but to have a vision transformed by looking through the very eyes of God. If I were to go around the room tonight and ask of you each individually the question, why we do what we do, I wonder how many of you might answer, to become holy. Just 2 weeks ago, on Sunday the 15th of May, Pope Francis canonised 10 new saints. And in his homily for that day, Pope Francis reminded us that the lives of the saints prove that holiness is not an unreachable goal, accomplished by a select few, but comes from acknowledging and sharing in God's love. And if we have a spare 10 minutes sometime, it's worth finding and worth reading. For in that homily, the Pope reflected on the Sunday Gospel of the day from St. John, in which Jesus calls his disciples to love one another as I have loved you. Christ's call, he said, should be the core of our own faith. A faith that recognises that our abilities and our merits are not the central thing, but rather the unconditional, free and unmerited love of God. Being disciples of Christ, and in Pope Francis's word, being missionary disciples, and advancing on the path of holiness, means first and foremost letting ourselves be transfigured by the power of God's love. Very different way of looking at the logic of faith. Let us never forget the primacy of God over self, of the Spirit over the flesh, and grace over works, the Pope said. We hear it so often, and yet how easily we forget it to allow it to penetrate into our lives. Jesus' call to love one another is not solely a call to imitate his love for humanity, but a reminder that we as Christians are able to love only because God has loved us, because he pours into our hearts the gift of the Holy Spirit, which is a spirit of holiness, a love that heals, a love that transforms. Each of us seeks to live a life according to that love. And any organisation within the church, whatever its structure, whatever its purpose, really has that as one of its great goals. To live one's life in accordance with that kind of love. And when you read through that book, and I hope you buy it in great numbers tonight, you see an extraordinary generosity of people willing to serve others, to make a difference. You can see the liberation, freedom, a very topical word, that talks about freeing people from the prison of greed and competitiveness. And a decision, a love that fights the cancer of indifference and the woodworm of self-referentiality. Learning to give is not always easy, and yet the story we celebrate tonight, our story, is one based on that extraordinary gift of giving. Giving of one's life is more than simply offering something of ours to others, but it's a way of surmounting our own selfishness in order to make our lives a gift. At the end of the homily, Pope Francis said, "The saints discovered an incomparable joy, and they became brilliant reflections of the Lord of history." He invited us to do the same, for each of us is called to holiness, to a form of holiness that is our own. Now, in focusing on this canonization just a couple of weeks ago, it reminds us, and it reminds me, that in all the different groups I'm involved in, if we don't have a care and a desire to become holy, then maybe we're not quite up to the mark about what we're on about. Maybe we need to change the function, that we might change the form. Maybe it's making more explicit what is actually implicit, because we don't like to parade our holiness. Most of us think we're probably not holy. But right from the time of, most recently, the Second Vatican Council, we have a call to universal holiness. This time tonight of Centenary is truly a remarkable celebration. A chance to stop and look back to what has been, and a pause to look forward to what might be. It's a chance to ask, if not to seek to answer those questions: why do we do what we do? And what is the need to which we are attempting to respond? I'd like to suggest tonight that one of the elements the Knights might like to consider is this question of holiness. It's not just reserved for the few or the many, but for all. I think Pope Francis is assisting us all in seeing that it's actually a possibility for us, and even attainable. This time in the life of the Church, we're in the midst of the first National Plenary Council for 80 years, in our own archdiocese, diocesan assemblies, and a church-wide synod to be gathered together in 2023. I ask myself, and I ask you, how is my sense of personal mission deeply connected to that of how the Spirit is leading the Church in the 21st century? The more we're in touch with our own story, the more humble we can be, but also more determined in the best sense of the word, to make the connections, to make sure communion is at the heart of all that we do. The path of holiness is not barred to anyone. And many of the stories of Paul Hawkes's book, a bold story, well proven, tell exactly of that. In your own hearts, you know the living history of the many who may never have used the term holiness, but have embodied and exemplified it in being agents of communion, often in a fractured world. May it be ever thus. The path of holiness is universal and starts with baptism. Let us all strive to follow it. For I guess my message tonight is that we are all called to this, and all our groups and organisations that support us should assist in that element. And the great thing is, holiness is actually an original. It's not a photocopy, it's not a sausage machine that pumps out everyone in the same way. Holiness is original. Mine, yours, all of us. It's uniquely our own. Because we've felt fractured, because we've felt in this space of tentativeness and anxiety, perhaps we've forgotten our own story a little. And truly, that the Lord has a plan for each and every one of us. Pope Francis often uses the word dream to talk about God's plan for humanity. To localize that, to personalize that, is not a very big step. But sometimes we don't do that. God has a dream for our lives, for each of us. May we pursue that dream with great joy. So thank you for this opportunity to say just a few words tonight, and to thank you for all that flows from your experience of being in communion with the living God and God's holy people. Might I invite you to pray for the second session of the Plenary Council, which begins on the 3rd of July, and for the Archdiocese of Adelaide and the Diocese of Port Pirie, who after that time will seek to find a way of implementing those recommendations coming from that council. It helps us to answer all of those important questions. What is the need to which we're trying to respond? We shall have some answers. Will we do it perfectly? Of course not. But will we try? Yes. Will we succeed? Mostly. But we do so because it actually makes us holy and transforms us. May we keep our eyes always fixed on Jesus, the perfecter and author of our faith. And even though you might forget the word Eusebius after tonight, I don't think that's in the quiz, but he does remind us that we have a story worth telling, a story tonight worth celebrating. Thank you and congratulations.
We now ask Brother Brian Cooper if he could respond to the Archbishop's request.
Okay, we'll get there. Thank you, Your Grace. What an awesome speech. You presented us with a lot of information and some challenges in what we expected tonight. The fraternal nature of our order has kept us strong in some tough times in the past. The Holy Spirit has provided the strength we need to keep focus on our practical commitment to the clergy and the church. We have often been referred to as the bishop's men and had much pleasure in developing great relationships with our bishops and archbishops. I feel that we are developing the same with you, Your Grace, and we appreciate you giving your time to be with us tonight as we celebrate our 100 years and to address us as you have. So thank you once again.